In this episode, Nomads' attitude towards death and ancient funeral traditions. Death is a mysterious line to which every living being approaches at different speeds and in different ways. It does not take bribes, does not enter into negotiations, does not revise the terms of the transaction, and never cancels its visit. Death exists by its own laws, which mankind cannot change. But people from ancient times tried to understand these laws and adapt to them, creating various traditions and rituals associated with death. On the territory of the Great Steppe, the shrouded scythemen gathered a rich harvest on the nomadic battlefields thousands of times. How did the brave inhabitants of the vast expanses accept its visits, and how did they accompany their loved ones to the last journey? For all nations, death is a taboo. It is what we do not know anything about. And since the topic is tabooed by fear, then here we are trying to deal with it somehow. But how? How did the ancients bury their dead? There are three main traditions. Why was it so important to follow the funeral traditions? Otherwise, this part of the soul, sulde, it can become the spirit of the locality. Cremation and air burial, the strength of the Aruach, the structure of the soul, and the mysterious empty graves. Watch in this episode. Death is one of the most terrible, mysterious, but at the same time interesting phenomena. Its inevitability scares humanity throughout its existence. In order to somehow be reconciled and prepared, people invented various ways. An old woman with a scythe and a black robe, from whom you can run away or come to an agreement, go to heaven if you lead a righteous life, or to be reborn in a new body. In each culture, these are their own ways. My name is Andrei Slozhin. It is the Time Puzzle, and today we will try to find out how nomads treated death. Every person on Earth thought about his death or the death of his loved ones. This is one of the global problems of all mankind. People try to create an elixir of immortality, slow down aging, but so far the advantage is not in our favor. In order to alleviate suffering in some way, we have to come up with a number of explanations and traditions that help a person reconcile himself with the loss of a loved one. Perhaps that is why, since ancient times, people believe that there is a place where the soul of the deceased goes and where you yourself can meet your ancestors after death. Each of these explanations, according to the statements of modern psychologists, are attempts to reduce our fear of hopelessness. This is what a practicing psychologist, Irina Novak, told us. For all nations, death is a taboo. It is what we do not know anything about. And since this topic is tabooed by fear, then here we are trying to deal with it somehow. But how? We are preparing for death. And someone says, let's use the version of the spiritual plan, the transition from one category of life to another. And then we should rejoice. But according to psychology, it is a little bit different. It is very important to realize that those who are gone, they are in our consciousness. Moreover, as we say, they are in our hearts. Many researchers believe that the creation of various myths about gods, about the afterlife and demons is nothing more than an attempt to preserve the memory of ancestors. This version is shared by archaeologists. For example, when we discuss the origin of the tradition of burial of the dead, archaeologist Alexander Goryachev confirmed that people began to bury their loved ones after they began to believe in the immortality of the soul. The funeral tradition in the history of mankind originates with the emergence of religious ideas about the soul by itself. In the system of religious ideologies, this tradition is called animism, faith in the spirit, faith in the soul. Modern archaeologists do not yet have exact data on when people first began to bury their loved ones. However, now there are at least two theories in the scientific community that state that the most ancient graves belong to approximately one time period, 5,000 years BC. One of them is located on the territory of modern Iraq. There, according to German researchers, the legendary king Gilgamesh, who ruled the city of Uruk, was buried. Archaeologists say that the grave they found is described in the Song of Gilgamesh, the oldest literary monument on clay tablets. The second ancient burial was found in the Chelyabinsk region. Scientists from the South Ural State University have found the grave, which is proposed to be considered the oldest known today in the entire Trans-Urals and Kazakhstan. This is a wooden crypt with the remains of a representative of the Saka tribe. According to the description of this grave, it is very similar in its structure to other graves, but they are dated at a later time and are located much to the south. I studied the territory of Kazakhstan, first of all the territory of southern Kazakhstan, with funerary monuments of the Bronze Age. This is a tradition that existed throughout the second millennium BC. There are three main traditions, and the rest, there are many different options because the fates of people are different. The circumstances of life and death are also very different. Thus, the scientists came to the conclusion that the tradition of burial on the territory of Kazakhstan was preserved for a long time from the Saks, who in turn borrowed it from an older Andronov tribe. Archaeologists have deduced at least three types of human burial in the steppes of Kazakhstan.
Первая традиция – это традиция трупоположения.
The first tradition is the position of the body, how the corpses of the deceased are placed in the grave. It is one of the earliest traditions. And in the Bronze Age, on the territory of southern Kazakhstan, and in general, in the Andron era, this tradition has just classic forms, a classic look. The most classic form is a stone box, 4 slabs. The stone cyst and the crypt, built inside the earth, are made of slabs laid flat and covered on top with a large stone slab. Usually a deceased one was put in the fetal position. His knees were pressed to his chest, his hands tied with leather straps at the chin. This was done because the ancients believed, thus they prepare the dead person for rebirth. But the type of grave or crypt depended directly on the area where people lived. In the upper reaches, in the high mountainous zone, in the foothill zone where there are trees, or in the forest steppe zone, for example in the northern Kazakhstan, the tradition of burying the dead in wooden log cabins or wooden frames inside was very developed, so their dwelling was built mainly of wood. While, as you guessed, stone dwellings are more characteristic for the steppe zone, and the grave is thus simply a model of the dwelling for the soul of a deceased person.
Модель жилища для души умершего человека.
Since the grave was a kind of dwelling, then accordingly it was necessary to fill it with the necessary homeware to stay in another world. To do this, the grave was piled with various utensils. A researcher at the Department of Ethnology and Anthropology at the Chokhan Valikhanov Institute of History and Ethnology, Bolat Smagulov, told us about this. Until the 18th century, there were examples when people were buried in everyday clothes, and there were weapons beside them. Sometimes there were burials even with a horse. But in the 19th century, however, general Muslim burials began to prevail. Coming up next, the most famous and mysterious grave in the world. The richer the deceased was, the more he had influence and authority during his life, the more he would need in the next world. Thus, the graves of the rulers often included servants, his wives, and even the most devoted soldiers and military leaders. The shaman of the Tengri tradition, Hovagan Tobet Kam, also knows about that. Representatives of some royal families, noble blood, khans, leaders, batars, warriors, shamans, some priests, they were buried according to well-established one or another ritual practice. When finding those or other mounds, burial grounds, people always found some bowls, lamps, oil shakers, and elements of weapons. If it was some kind of leader, his personal nukers, warriors, and some concubines would be killed to bury them with them. Thus, according to the many legends, one of the largest graves where, according to the assumptions, a huge number of jewels, horses, slaves, and concubines were buried with the deceased, and, which by the way has not yet been found, is considered the tomb of Genghis Khan. Scientists and researchers for a long time studied the manuscript The Secret Legend of the Mongols, which was compiled in 1240 by an unknown author. However, there was no answer where the tomb of Genghis Khan was. The famous traveler Marco Polo also sought the tomb of the universe shaker. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but by the end of the 13th century, the Mongols themselves did not know where his tomb was located. Another scientist, Lev Gumilyov, could not find an answer to this question either. The only thing that the historian, geographer, and archaeologist Gumilyov managed to establish was the moment of transportation of the body and the process of burial itself. This is what he writes in his writings. The cold body of the great conqueror was already far from the places filled with human blood. The gloomy Mongolian horsemen, killing all oncoming on the way, carried him to their native steppes. They threw the remains of Genghis Khan together with many valuable things into the dug grave and slaughtered all the slaves who carried out the funeral works. According to custom, exactly 1 year later it was necessary to celebrate a wake. In order to accurately find the place of burial, the Mongols did the following. On the grave, they sacrificed a little camel just taken from the mother. And a year later, the camel itself found in the boundless steppe a place where her cult was killed. Killing the camel, the Mongols performed a rite of commemoration and left the grave forever. The Nomads' picture of the world was radically different. There was no concept of hell. There was no idea, no division to up and down, good and bad. And the Nomad understood that the soul of man, as it were, does not consist of one component. There were three components. That is, as in the picture of the world, the three components, the upper, middle, and lower worlds, as well as the filling of the person, came from at least three components, although in fact there are more. Have you heard, probably, a phrase such that a Turk has several souls? So briefly and concisely, that is the element called Ami is the element of the upper world, Sulde is an element of the middle world, and Sunezu is an element of the lower world. It is known that during the reign of Genghis Khan, his attitude towards various religions was loyal. In his empire, mosque and Orthodox Church, Buddhists, and Tengrians could coexist peacefully. It's quite interesting that there is no exact information about the religion of the greatest commander. There is only indirect historical evidence. Sulde banners of Genghis Khan. So near his Khan's stakes, there were always long peaks with such similarities of flag made of the wolf fur, and it was all adorned with a wolf head, sometimes with sharp peaks. And it all symbolized the power of the race or the power of the ancestral spirits. The Kazakhs still have the concept of Arwah, the spirit of the ancestor. His name became the battle cry of the batters during the battles. Arwaks were called for protection and blessing in various situations. Because Arwaks are memory, they are the power of the race. But not the whole soul of the ancestor became Arwak. The ancient steppe dwellers believed that the immortal spirit consists of several parts. Ami, being part of the upper world after man died, naturally returned to the upper world. Sunezu returned to the lower world, to the realm of Yerlik and Ulgen. And Sulde always remains in the middle world. That is, such things as honoring the ancestors of the Turks is very strongly developed, and after death, if his descendants honor the memory of a deceased person, remember him, carry out some ritual practices, then this part of the soul turns into a spirit of that kind, into arwah. A spirit that protects, that helps. Otherwise, this part of the soul, sulde, it can become the spirit of the locality. That is, a person lived in this area, in this place, and after death, he can become the spirit of the tree, the spirit of water. Only recently, modern psychologists have managed to explain such reverence by the ancient nomads of dead people. Genetic and psychological memory are important aspects that shape a person as a person, and the steppe inhabitants knew about it on an intuitive level. Understanding that I'm not alone, there's a huge race behind my back, and this is my memory, an integrity of self-understanding. Gives me, well, in general, some kind of image. I'm a representative of someone, and all who lived before me in my psyche. Moreover, we are talking about psychological scenarios that we inherit, and the techniques tell us that if we forget someone, we don't remember them correctly. We forget about those who are gone, then something happens to us. That is a huge system called a genetic structure, a huge system which all 6 generations came to before me, and 7 with me, and these people are not alive, and if we don't remember them, then the system does something like that we have to remember them. Kazakhs still have a tradition to bury their ancestors in one cemetery, as well as to perform this ceremony of commemoration, which, according to historians, originates even before the spread of Islam. Kazakhs, or generally nomads, did it on the 3rd day, on the 7th day, on the 40th day, or year, for example. Moreover, a memorial service is arranged on every Thursday. There is a special name, Beysembilik, from the word Beysembe, Thursday. Coming up next, who and how was cremated in the ancient steppe? In the course of studying the burial traditions of the tribes of nomadic peoples who lived on the territory of modern Kazakhstan, we managed to establish that the creation of graves and crypts was the most common burial method. However, few people know, but here they also cremated the departed.
Вторая традиция, собственно, с которой мы сталкиваемся при захоронении, это захоронение кремированных останков людей. Кремированных останков. И здесь...
The second tradition we encounter at burial is the burial of cremated human remains, and here, with all the nuances, there's a lot more options. But more often we find the cremated remains of people inside the graves in the form of some small cluster. Cleared forms of clusters give us a pot shape.
Расчищенные формы скоплений дают нам форму горшка. Отсюда появилось мнение, что вероятнее всего во время погребального процесса от места кремации умершего до...
Hence the opinion that most likely during the burial process the deceased was moved in a kind of earthen vessel from the place of cremation to the actual grave. There are cremated remains scattered around the perimeter of the grave, and here we can find some parallels of the Indo-European peoples, primarily India or the Far East, where the dead who were cremated were transferred to the grave in the skin of a ram, deer, or bull. And with the skin, they were placed in the grave. In this case, the dust may be in the grave in a slightly scattered form.
В могилу. Вот в этом случае прах может оказаться в могиле встречен, скажем так, немного в разбросанном виде.
According to historians, this method of burial was practiced in the era of the Middle Paleolithic. Later in the Bronze Age, cremation was used along with the usual burial. As archaeologists note, most likely this kind of funeral is associated with a religious understanding of the world among people of that time. Take, for example, the Vikings. They believed that the soul, along with its smoke, rises to Valhalla, the battle hall of fame for the most powerful and brave, where the warrior will feast, fight all the time. All nations on all continents, they have such a thing as he went to the ancestors. The territory that was inhabited by the Turks, nomads, it is very great, very big, and here you need to take into account the peculiarities of the landscape, geography, climatic conditions, and so on and so forth. Naturally, nomads did not adopt the tradition of cremation from Vikings or Hindus. This type of burial was due to several factors, and the main one is religion.
Период до ислама, период до христианства. Как вам известно, на территории
In the period before Islam, in the period before Christianity, as you know, there was such a concept, a phenomenon. I don't know how to properly call it. Now it is called Tengrism. This is the world view. It did not have its own shamans, sorcerers per se. That is, in this worldview there were the priests, if we speak correctly, and accordingly these priests had their own ritual practice. As proof of these words, there are a huge number of graves found on the territory of Kazakhstan, where the bodies of the dead were cremated. Moreover, the process of cremation was quite complicated and required a special approach. This funeral custom was more clearly and strongly pronounced in our mountains of the Trans-Ili Alatau in the upper reaches of the gorge Turgen. First, for cremation, for the burial of such cremated remains, special dishes were made. Its prerequisite was the absence of open fire during firing. That is, the molded vessel which was intended for burial was just filled with the cooling ash. In no case could open fire be used. The height of such vessels was 60 to 70 centimeters. The remains of the cremated body was lowered into this vessel. It was covered with stone from above and, in addition, coated with clay. This was done in order to limit the access of air to ash.
Это было обязательно. После чего для него не рыли, не было, а вырвалась яма по форме.
It was a must. After that, they did not dig a separate grave, but a hole according to the shape of this vessel itself. And the vessel was covered with stones. This tradition is considered to be Proto-Zoroastrian, since it originated, well, at least about 700 to 800 years before the appearance of Zoroastrianism as a religious worldview system in general in the history of mankind. According to this religion, it was considered a great sin to bury a human body in open ground. It was unacceptable. That's why the remains were placed in vessels, and their sealing minimized the risks of body contact with the ground. Also, human remains were often folded into the skin of an animal, usually a camel. Many researchers believe that this tradition was later adopted and transformed into the funeral rite of Muslims when the body of the deceased was wrapped in a shroud.
Сколько можно сделать вариантов могильных конструкций?
How many variants of grave structures can be made? A pit, a wooden blockhouse, a stone box, or a cist, a crypt, can be built, right? In the rock, in the catacomb. I mean, there is also quite a limited number of what can be made. And there are about 150 different nations, nationalities, even in the territory of Eurasia only. And everyone has their own certain traditions. But the most common way to bury a person in the steppe was still the traditional burial in the mound. On the territory of Kazakhstan, there is a huge amount of evidence of this. One of the most important historical finds for the country, which tells about the life of ancient people, was discovered in a mound near the city of Almaty. The Golden Man, the Saka warrior, a member of the royal family, is now one of the symbols of the independent Kazakhstan. And he was found quite by accident. In 1968, the village of Issyk received city status. it was necessary to expand its boundaries. They singled out a place for the construction of a motor depot, on the territory of which the barrow was located. While studying it, no remains were found, but at that time the young archaeologist Beken Nurmuhanbetov asked the bulldozer to walk within a radius of 10 meters from the main part of the mound. Then the secret section of the grave was discovered, which seemed empty. The mound can be empty for two reasons. It was looted, and bones were taken away by wild animals, or it is a special type of burial without a dead person, the so-called cenotaph. But why did the nomads create similar cenotaphs?
Человек мог погибнуть в бою, пропасть без вести. Его могли растерзать.
A man could die in battle, go missing, wild animals could tear him to pieces. That is, under some circumstances, the body of the deceased was not there, but he must be buried in order to be in the general system.
В общей системе, и он должен быть погребен вместе со своими ближайшими родственниками. И вот некоторые
And he should be buried with his closest relatives. And here are some burials made exactly according to this principle. All the traditions of burial have been followed to the extent that there are dishes and some things, objects, decorations, and the traces of the remains of the deceased are completely absent, at least in whatever form. A vivid example of cenotaphs is the Egyptian pyramids. So, for example, 4 large pyramids were built for Pharaoh Snofru, 3 of which are cenotaphs. According to historians, for the first time, cenotaphs began to be erected during the Neolithic. The Varna Cemetery is considered the oldest grave complex where there are similar graves. The necropolis is located on the territory of modern Bulgaria and dates back to the 5th millennium BC. It was here that for the first time masks were found in some graves instead of bodies.
Есть еще один вариант таких ценотафов, которому, у нас, допустим, в эпоху бронзы посвящался не одно.
There is one more example of such cenotaphs, which in our Bronze Age didn't include only one burial, but a whole grave complex. Here in the same upper reaches of the Turgan Gorge, the 3 fences symbolized a kind of ritual burial, most likely of an ancestor, because only in one fence people had found a fragment, an incomplete skull, and apparently it was reburied. And the rest of the fence most likely symbolized his body, legs, and so on. So this is a ritual burial of a certain ancestor or some very important character. And most likely this grave was special, like the burial of a holy person or some special person.
И, вероятнее всего, эта могила посещалась особо как захоронение святого человека.
As we today dedicate the graves of the saints or the graves of some very important historical figures. In the modern world, too, there is a huge number of cenotaphs that we meet in everyday life. There are such original monuments or stone slabs that are installed along the roads to dead pedestrians or drivers, air crash victims, climbers, and even submariners. There are such memorials in any country. Modern people have become accustomed to them and know that it is, just as the ancients were not surprised by another method of burial that later entered the folklore of many nations of the world as a harbinger of grief and encounters with evil spirits. Coming up next, the most unusual and rare type of burial. In folk tales and epics, there is such a character as Baba Yaga, who lives in a hut on chicken legs. We used to perceive it as children's horror stories. However, these legends have a plausible rationale.
Такие понятия, как Кощей Бессмертный, Баба Яга, Костяная нога.
Concepts like Koshe Baba Yaga, bone leg, it's all very interesting, of course. In fact, the concept of Baba Yaga, I have first word Baba. In fact, it is necessary to pronounce it with shifted emphasis Baba. Baba, here in Turkestan, we have the mausoleum of Arslan Bab. The word Bab, Baba, it translates as a great ancestor, the most important old man. So Baba Yaga's bone leg meant that with one leg she was standing in the world of people, in the world of the living.
Яга имелось в виду, что одной ногой она стоит в этом мире, в мире людей, в мире живых, а костяной ногой...
And with a bone leg, she is in the world of spirits, in the world of her ancestors, in the world of the same Arwaks. Baba Yaga is such an illustrative character.
Баба Яга — это очень такой показательный персонаж.
In Russian fairy tales, this character had a double meaning. On the one hand, she was an insidious old woman who tricked the travelers into her hut and then ate them. On the other hand, Baba Yaga often helped her guests with good advice or with magic weapons against a more sinister enemy. And in the conditions of an ancient steppe, this character could arise in a very unusual way.
Почему я вспомнил про Бабу Ягу? Потому что у турков, у кочевников...
Why I remembered Baba Yaga? Because the Turks, the Nomads, in the period before Islam came to our steppes, in the period before Christianity, and in general in the period before any certain denomination religion, there was such practice. In the field, 3 trees were found. These were either birch trees or certain sorts of coniferous trees, preferably spruce. For nomads, spruce was a sacred tree. Murat Aji wrote about it. And for a dead person, they made such a similarity to a sarcophagus or a cradle and hung up at a certain height. And it looked like this: such a sarcophagus, a wooden box and 2 pillars, 2 trees. And accordingly, from the outside, it looked like a hut on chicken legs. And why do you think they would do that? First of all, in order to prevent the body from eating, to keep it from wild animals, wolves, bears, jackals, some hyenas. And moreover, this sarcophagus, again, as we said earlier, it was equipped with everything necessary for later life. Unfortunately, such burials were not found by modern archaeologists. Information about them came to us only from legends and stories of travelers. There were some air burials, however, people mentioned it until the 18th century. For example, a Russian traveler wrote in his journal, "The dead are hanged on a tree," and he was there, and he gave such a colorful description that they are like leaves, although it is strange now to imagine the situation, but nonetheless, in the 19th century, such descriptions no longer exist.
Хотя вот это странно сейчас представить эту ситуацию, да, но тем не менее уже в 19 веке таких описаний уже нет.
This kind of burial was used by the people who practiced shamanism. It was believed that this way it is easier for the soul to go into the afterlife. Now, for the modern man, it is unusual, but the fence around the grave will surprise no one, although, you know, this is also an ancient tradition. With the spread of religion and its layering on pagan beliefs, the ancient people began to receive various superstitions regarding dead people. It was believed that if a person drowned, he becomes a mermaid or a waterman, who afterwards will lure into the water and drown passing travelers. There was a huge number of legends associated with werewolves, vampires, and witches. For example, archaeologists find a lot of graves in which a cobblestone is inserted into the teeth of the dead. Scientists call them vampire crypts. In the old days, they believed that this way you can protect the living. The second level of protection from the evil spirit or demon was the fence, but few people know that the fence set long before the appearance of such legends.
Создать могилу — это еще...
To create a grave is still only a part of the funeral tradition as such. A mandatory attribute around these graves is a fence. Graves in the Bronze Age must have been protected, and the fence could be completely different designs. It could be a series of vertically dug stones or a fence of horizontally laid plates. It even could be a circular ditch.
Это мог быть вообще круговой ровик. Сама ограда символизировала.
The fence itself symbolized the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. This is one aspect. On the other hand, it also had a different symbolic meaning.
Это еще и имело иное символическое значение.
The structure of the grave symbolized the model of the world. The ancients believed that the fence, it is visible, the middle world. The mound on top symbolized the firmament or upper world. The deceased was placed in the recess, that is, in the lower world. Thus, the grave was like a conductor for the soul of the dead and some kind of model and copy of the world tree, which is described in the myths and legends of almost all ancient peoples.
Человечество никогда ничего не забывает из того, что оно
Mankind never forgets history. This translates into certain actions, traditions, including the funeral rites. And we, committing these actions, even in our modern life, often simply do not imagine that the reason for this is about the deep beliefs of our ancestors, ancient religious beliefs. Today, these ideas are perceived by us at the subconscious level as a certain ritual that we perform when something happens in our lives, be it a wedding, childbirth, or, on the contrary, the burial of a loved one.
Свадьба, рождение ребенка, или наоборот, захоронение близкого человека, погребение близкого человека.
Similarly, another funeral tradition has been transformed, namely the process of the funeral service of the deceased. According to one version of the researchers, the funeral nothing more than a modified cry of relatives and friends of the deceased. There is still the tradition of funeral weeping, and people expressed certain emotions in a certain poetic rhymed form. It is rather a pre-Islamic tradition, and maybe it is even more universal because funeral laments, they are fixed regardless of religion in different parts of the world.
Более общечеловеческое, потому что похоронный плач, они фиксируются независимо от религии в разных частях света.
According to another version, these are certain instructions to the soul when moving from one world to another, which were given by a shaman or a priest, and they were in almost every tribe. In modern religious denominations, the soul is also escorted, only not to the ancestors, but to heaven. In any region, wherever it happens, fire was kindled, certain prayers were read, and these prayers did not consist of any treatises. That is, seeing a person on his last journey, such prayers were read. It is still present both in shamanic and ritual practice for 2-3 days. On the 41st day, not even prayers are recited, but certain words are said, a certain ritual practice so that the soul day, a single part of a person, so that it is not lost, so that it can find the way to its ancestors. There is a third version that modern psychologists are now talking about. A version that is not confirmed by any historical artifacts or records in the books of ancient travelers, religious workers, or shamans. This version is in the human subconscious. The speed of life made those rituals that had meaning, deep meaning, turned them into a formality. In fact, the movement of the soul, this is the flow of love of the clan structure from the roots to us. It gives us life. It gives us the potential to cope with something. And I think that a huge number of burial rituals were associated with this, to extend this life, to extend the connection even with those who are gone, who have left us. This is such an interesting moment when nothing can be fixed in the physical world, but we are trying to fix it at the level of love. Sometimes death really gives tremendous tremors for the development of our soul. Now, the funeral is held according to the religious preferences of this or that person. Muslims by the rules of the Quran, the Catholics and Orthodox Christians according to their faith and rites. Many cremate their relatives. Every nation has its own standards of behavior in the death of a loved one. On the territory of Kazakhstan and other CIS countries, death is considered a grief. In Mexico, some countries in Africa and Indonesia, people rejoice or laugh at funerals. It is believed that they should be different from the dead by their vitality. They have to show death that they're alive. Mourning colors and clothes are also different, and this has changed and transformed since the appearance of man over thousands of years. What remains unchanged is that death awaits everyone.
Это лишь малая основная часть того, что удалось рассказать о способах отправиться в
This is only a small part of what we could tell you about the last journey. To be honest, the topic was as scary as it was interesting. And no matter how hard the scientists try, death continues to be a mystery and frightens with its ruthlessness and surprise. However, as the German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht said, do not fear death so much, but rather the inadequate life. My name is Andrei Slozhin. It was the Time Puzzle. See ya.